So this session is on the green transition. I'll run through in a second some of the topics that will likely come up. First, our speakers. So furthest from me is James Meadway. James is the former director of the Progressive Economy Forum and was recently appointed the Economic Affairs Officer to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And James also has a great podcast, which hopefully you'll have the chance to plug during the session. Next to me is Holly Rowden. Holly is policy advisor at the Green Alliance, which was founded in 1979 to engage decision makers in dialogue on important environmental issues. And then in the middle, we have Councillor Jude, who is program director at Green Finance Institute and deputy cabinet member for climate action and biodiversity at the City of Westminster Council. Okay, so as with the previous panel, everyone's going to speak for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll have the second half of the session for all of your questions. James, would you like to kick off?
Is this working? Yes, it is. Okay. Well, thank you for the invite to speak. I should just say that obviously I'm speaking in a strictly personal capacity here. This isn't with any kind of professional hat sitting on me, so I'm just offering some personal opinions rather than anything else at this point. But I wanted to start with, I don't know if it's the elephant in the room, but the £28 billion is obviously a little bit of a contentious issue. It didn't need to be. Genuinely, I don't think there was any need for Labour to say we were now going to have to wind back in this. And they offered two different reasons for saying they needed to wind back on the initial commitment, which was an average spend of £28 billion a year on green investment for the Green Prosperity Plan over 5 years, possibly 10 years, presumably if you get re-elected, to pay for the transition in our energy systems. And they didn't need to wind back in it, I don't think, for two reasons. The first is that by offering two conflicting, actually, or at least contrasting explanations as to why this was happening, I think they've potentially severely undermined the opportunity that they might have had in government to actually push for this to happen. Because there is a reason why you can't spend £28 billion immediately on getting into government, on a massive investment programme. And it's basically, this is the legacy of Britain being a very, very low investment country. That we, compared to the rest of the OECD group of developed economies, we chronically underinvest and have done for decades. And if you get really carried away, you want to do a really deep cut in it, you can go all the way back to the 1870s, so that period of underinvestment. But certainly for the last 40 years, consistently, year in, year out, at the bottom end of developed economy investment relative to GDP. And there's a legacy in that, and the legacy is low productivity. And the legacy is difficulty getting wages to increase. And the legacy is this huge, great current account deficit. You import lots of things from the rest of the world. Very specifically, if you're talking about, well, now we're going to try and reindustrialize, we want to move rapidly to decarbonize our energy systems, it means that first your legacy energy systems, which is becoming a problem all over the world, that things like your grid is not well adapted to the kinds of installations you want to make, the smaller scale installations of wind farms up and down the country, for example. Your grid is not well adapted to that. In any case, it's already a bit on the ancient side. Now, this is a fairly common problem across the world, but it's one we're going to start running into here. And that you also don't have the capacity, either in terms of the skills of people who can actually go out and build wind farms and the rest of it, or just the capacity to actually build those wind farms, that you don't have the supply chains in place. That if you went off and said, we want to spend immediately £28 billion straight away on decarbonisation, and a kind of technology-led decarbonisation, I think that's the kind of pitch that's being put here, that you don't have the capacity to do that, and all you really do is run off and have to buy a whole load of wind turbines from Denmark or Germany or wherever. And it's a massive sort of increase in your import bill at a time where the current account deficit is already looking like a perennial problem. And that's, by the way, that's a recurring theme in most attempts by Labour governments since the end of the Second World War to try and say, we want a programme of investment. Your programme of investment runs into this problem that you have a legacy of past not doing the investments, and that means that you end up with just driving up imports of the stuff you say you want to need to make the investment happen. So that's actually a constraint. And it's a constraint because we're already in a bad place, so it's hard to get out of being in a bad place. Now, that's a reason why you can't immediately do this. The bit that isn't a constraint, the bit that shouldn't have been introduced to that conversation, the bit that's unnecessary is to say, oh, well, actually the borrowing situation for government has now got worse because it's really expensive, relatively expensive for government to borrow compared to what it was 10 years ago. Now, this is another legacy of failure. We did have, for a while, the lowest interest rates in human history. You know, coming out of the 2008 crisis into about 2011 onwards, exceptionally low interest rates here and across the developed world. And what we did with that was basically nothing or worse. George Osborne absolutely smashed capital investment over his first few years in office. It was shrunk by £20 billion in real terms. That he didn't go out and say, we can use these low interest rates to build the wind turbines that we know we're going to need, the offshore tidal power, the various other sort of big tech investments you might want to make. In fact, they did the opposite. The Treasury under George Osborne had a decidedly anti-renewable, anti-green bias to its way of thinking, that subsidies were cut for example, building wind turbines early in the technological process where you need to put the subsidies in, we cut them. So you don't have that manufacturing capacity here. That's what we did when interest rates were low. Now, the fact that interest rates are higher doesn't mean you don't still need to do some of these things. It's just going to be harder to do it. And part of the reason it's going to be harder to do it, or part of the consequences of that, is that you also then need a more serious conversation about taxes and how we're going to address some of the biases in the tax system. And Labour, as things stand, has pretty well ruled much of that out, even to seeing fairly low-hanging fruit, like equalising capital gains tax and income tax rates, something that Nigel Lawson, as Chancellor, Tory Chancellor in 1986, managed to do, has been kind of ruled out at this point in time. And the usual estimate for this is another £16 billion a year, mostly taken from wealthy people who overwhelmingly are the people who pay capital gains tax. If you're not going to have that more serious conversation about redistribution, about taxes, then, okay, you're going to undermine what you might want to do on the green transition over here. So you end up with something of a mess. And because you've set up these two conflicting arguments, one of which has some truth to it, the other of which is basically a kind of political choice, you are undermining your program for investment, because it's confused now. We have a serious problem. There has been underinvestment. There has been specific underinvestment, despite the huge potential in this country, in renewable energy and in the green transition. That is a problem to solve, and you can be quite upfront with people about, this is difficult, we're going to have to put some effort in. The bit that is fake is the bit about the financial situation, and that means we can't now do the things that need to be done. And you mix those two up, I think that creates a political confusion in there. It's also, just to be clear, I mean, may as well put this one out. £28 billion is quite a long way short of the actual investment that needs to happen to reach net zero even by 2050. I mean, the Committee on Climate Change says coming out of the 2020s into the 2030s, we need an increase of investment of capital spending of about 50 to 60 billion pounds a year. So you're kind of under half of that, which is fine, because you can say, we'll do this part, the private sector will do the rest. IPPR, on their calculations a few years back, suggested you need about £33 billion to get that leverage from the private sector. So it was already looking a bit less than what you might want to do to get there. These are all relatively significant problems, but not insurmountable, because having said we are going to spend the money is still there, and it has still to be spent, and there is some capacity to think about what you might do with it. And I think one of the weaknesses, part of the reason that specific figure was pushed back on, was that there was a kind of collective failure across the left, the centre left, whatever, to say, okay, this is what we think this money should be spent on, that we never defined what it was, that we weren't able to say, this is a definite commitment to make this investment here that will create these jobs for these people, this is how it happens. I don't think we did enough of that, and I think we need to now quite rapidly think about catching up to say, okay, this is what it will look like. It's not just a political problem. I mean, £28 billion is meaningless to basically everyone. No one can envisage what this is, but you might be able to think about, okay, this is what it will look like to have a factory actually producing these wind turbines. This is where they'll be installed. These are the jobs you'll have. That starts to make it a bit more concrete, a bit more real for people, and it defends the commitment to the spend because you're pinning it to something definite that's going to happen. Now, the other bit to throw in there, and I want to sort of conclude around this point, is that a great deal of discussion we've had around decarbonisation, around the transition, I think, misses out on two things. The first is something that is also actually just a general problem with the British economy, which is that if you talk about low productivity, the productivity problem is a low average productivity across British firms. Now, you can argue backwards and forwards about how we measure productivity and what it really means and this sort of thing. It's just kind of low here. And that's a constraint on what we can do, broadly speaking. it's driven not by a few exceptionally productive, best-in-the-world manufacturing locations typically, and you can talk about financial services if you want, but let's talk about manufacturing. So car manufacturing in Britain is extremely productive on an international basis, because it's very, very competitive, it's export-led, that sort of thing. But it's a very long tail of much, much less productive companies there. And there's something similar that happens with decarbonisation, that the wins on decarbonisation are not so much, can we get a few big high-end things to happen? Can we install a massive offshore wind farm, which is actually happening a bit? Can we even make a massive onshore wind farm? It's the smaller things further down the chain where you're starting to have to think about, can we insulate a very large number of people's lofts properly? Can we tweak slightly how our cities and our towns operate so there's less driving taking place? And there's all these smaller scale, less glamorous, less exciting, in some cases less technologically led interventions that need to happen. And the risk with talking about £28 billion in GB energy and all that sort of thing is that it falls out slightly. I do think when Rachel Reeves has spoken about the everyday economy, it's kind of looking at this kind of sets of issues, that it's the interventions on a smaller scale, not the big, glamorous, here we go, it's a whacking great wind turbine and all the rest of it, or it's some fantastic new technology we're going to invent. It's something that's everyday, that's going to fit in, that's actually going to have that practical impact on people's lives and decarbonisation on that scale. And the final bit is the other bit that we tend to not talk about too much, but, I mean, look at the weather, and to be a bit crude, is adaptation. Like climate change for too long, we've tended to think about it as something that is distant in the future, potentially distant in space. It's something that's happening somewhere else, and it is. There are disastrous things happening around the world, but it's a long way off. It's not going to happen yet, and therefore we've got time to change what we're doing and hold off this disaster. That isn't the case anymore. Like the impacts we're seeing today, very clearly, and you can see it in things like inflation. Why have olive prices gone through the roof? Because 60% of Spain is in drought, so there's a shortage of olives, so of course the price goes up. Last year, when the Rhine dried up and you couldn't take boats down it because of the heat, the water level dropped. Transport costs in Europe are forced up. The Panama Canal is going through a similar thing. These are all tied into a changing climate. These are all the consequences of adaptation. So we need, in addition to thinking about how you do the transition, how you decarbonise, there needs to also be some effort put into thinking about how we adapt to a world that's already changing. And that, I think, is perhaps the biggest political risk in all of this, is that we'll be asking people to change how they live and how they act and how they work, and we want lots of big investment, and we want to decarbonise our energy systems in particular, at the same time as all the adaptation costs are starting to arrive. And you can easily see the political argument being something like, I could almost hear it from Nigel Farage or someone similar, being something like, why are we doing all this when all of these disasters are already happening? What's the point spending this money? Why aren't we concentrating on something over here? We have to find a way to get those two bits to match up. It may well involve, unfortunately, an additional commitment of funding to get there. But until we start to have that conversation of tying in mitigation, decarbonisation, how you strip out carbon greenhouse gases from our energy and other systems, with a conversation about how do we adapt to a world that's already changing, I think the whole programme has got that kind of longer-term risk attached to it.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, it's really great to see you all. Feeling very grateful for the aircon on this very sweaty day. So I think, yeah, I'm going to probably echo a lot of what James has just said, but I guess just to kind of provide a bit of the bigger picture as well. So I'll talk a bit about why the green transition is so important and why it absolutely should be a priority for a centre-left government, and indeed any serious, credible government. And then I'll talk a bit about the why, kind of what that should actually look like in practice, and then touch on the politics a bit. And really keen to get into that question around the 28 billion, and I'm sure we'll kind of come to that because that's obviously a very live conversation. So just to kind of start, as a lot of us already know, why is the transition so important? The kind of urgency of the climate crisis has obviously never been more clear. The latest IPCC reports, the latest CCC reports show that the world is dangerously close to reaching the kind of critical 1.5 degree threshold. That's 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, and therefore every country needs to do what it can to reduce emissions as much as possible. And obviously some countries need to do a lot more than others and bear more responsibility for that. But just to kind of bring that home to the UK, Green Alliance's latest policy tracker, which tracks government progress against meeting its net zero target with the policies that have been announced, sorry, getting used to holding a microphone. Our latest update to that, which was published just this week, found that only 35% of the emissions cuts that we need to see to meet net zero actually have any policy frameworks in place to deliver those, and therefore we need to see much more ambitious kind of short-term action. The second kind of broad point is that the green economy and the green transition is the best way to tackle both the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis together. Obviously, the cost of living crisis will be arguably the defining issue of the next election, and it's something that is being really felt in a very, very real way by people across the country and has been for some time. And it doesn't look like it will get any better anytime soon in terms of energy prices, food prices, housing prices. So that's really, really important. And there's lots of evidence that green investments can really boost productivity, as kind of James touched on, can lead to high quality jobs and new industries, really kind of boost wages, and that kind of revamped industrial strategy could really kind of give a new sense of purpose and pride to the kind of UK economy. So investing at scale in low carbon technology is really the kind of best route to economic renewal in the UK and to kind of bring down energy bills long term. And we really don't want the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis to be two things that are seen as, you can only tackle one rather than tackling them together. Final point on why it's so important is there is such strong public support for climate action and kind of investing in the clean economy. Polling consistently shows that for the public, climate and environment is either kind of top 5 or top 3 concerns across voter groups, and people really want to see more action from government. So just kind of moving on to what that should, so if we're all agreed about why the green transition is so important, I hope, what should that then kind of look like in practice, and what should some of the priorities be around that? So first and foremost, I think the transition obviously needs to be fair. It needs to, as kind of James touched on, it needs to bring people along. It needs to show them in a very tangible way how it can benefit their everyday lives, and not just be this kind of abstract thing that is sort of cased in policy jargon. It also needs to, we need to ensure that that transition doesn't just further deepen or entrench the existing inequalities that we see in our economy. Only a transition that is perceived and felt as fair and where people and communities are really actually supported will succeed. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity and nuance around how you actually do that, but that priority should be built into all the kind of the policy thinking around that. Secondly, the kind of cross-sector collaboration is really important. I think there's been a really positive shift in people that are kind of thinking about this and policymakers, that this really does cut across the whole economy. It's not just a kind of siloed thing that is climate, but actually has really broad implications for public services more broadly, and health and education, and accordingly should be kind of built into those policy areas as well. Government also needs to really recognise the risks of under-delivery and delay, and that the costs, the costs of inaction far outweigh the kind of costs of action, now. One thing I also want to just add is, obviously this conversation is kind of understandably being quite focused on energy and climate, but nature is also in crisis, particularly, biodiversity decline. That's really, really quite concerning. And so, although it's, it's very positive, Labour's ambition on climate is impressive, and that's really good to see. We need to see that kind of leadership, but nature can really help to deliver on these kind of climate promises, as well as helping to kind of mitigate and adapt. That point about adaptation, nature-based solutions will be so key there. Can also boost well-being, tackle health inequalities. So really, I'm really keen to see more detail from Labour on what their pitch for nature is, and I think that really needs a lot more kind of development. Nature-based solutions are obviously also a lot cheaper than technological ones, and offer all kinds of benefits to food security, air and water quality. So just to kind of bring that all together and kind of touch on the politics, obviously I'm sure it's not lost on anyone in this room what a pivotal moment we are in. It's possible that we will have a Labour government next year. Obviously don't want to bank on anything, but for the first time in kind of 12 years, which is really significant. This is also the decade where, going back to those kind of IPCC and CCC reports, now is the decade of delivery where we really need to see a lot of those changes that will be absolutely imperative to meet net zero, and without them, we're just not going to get there. So it's really important. I think there's also a question around what a kind of centre-left government could do, but also, what is the role of the opposition after the next election? How can we ensure that a lot of the successes we've seen on climate and environmental policy have been because there has been strong cross-party support for those policies. So how can that be maintained and strengthened? A lot of the kind of key allies in the Conservative Party, people like Chris Skidmore, like Alok Sharma, a lot of those key MPs are stepping down. So, you know, how can the opposition also hold a centre-left government if they get in and win the election? How can they hold them to account as well? I think that's worth thinking about. I guess just final point, just to kind of briefly touch on the sort of 28 billion point, I think it's also worth remembering, and I'm keen to hear thoughts on this ongoing question around Labour's kind of desire to prove their economic credibility, and the point about when you get so used to losing, what that does to ambition and how to kind of, and what we've seen around kind of party discipline and the kind of current shadow cabinet, kind of relatively inexperienced in terms of government, and what the implications there are for what we might see in terms of them building out the policy detail over the next 12 months. So I think that's just worth bearing in our minds as well. I think I'll leave it there, but really keen to kind of dive into the questions afterwards. Thanks.
Straight in? Is that on? Yeah, great. So I'm probably going to end up agreeing with a lot of what's been said, unsurprisingly, and hopefully expanding on some points. So as Karl said, I'm Ryan Jude. I'm a councillor here in Westminster, Deputy Cabinet Member for Climate Action and Biodiversity. I also am Programme Director at the Green Finance Institute, where I lead work on the green taxonomy, which I'll touch on in a bit. For those who aren't familiar, GFI was established by the government to provide independent advice around greening the financial system, greening the economy. We're a non-profit set up with that specific aim. I'm also on the advisory group of the new Labour Climate and Environment Forum, but for today, like James, it's all personal opinions. None of this represents any of those institutions. So I think the timing for this discussion is really crucial, and we touched on this already. It's because of the recent rhetoric in the news, which I'm sure we'll go into a bit more detail on later, but also because the overarching message for this conference today is, and I'm quoting, not only to win power for the next election, but to also devise a credible governing strategy for the next decade. And for that reason, I think this panel, and I'm not biased, is probably the most important, because it underpins both of those things. Climate is central in terms of what we're putting out to the electorate. As Holly said, it continues to be one of the top concerns for all the key demographics for Labour. But it's also intrinsically linked to all those other things that are put as top concerns. Cost of living crisis, energy, the NHS. We can link climate to all of those quite effectively, actually. And this comes to saying to voters, how is this 28 billion pledge going to actually impact their lives? And I'll come to that a little bit more in a second. But ultimately, it's an economic question. And Ed Miliband recently has come out a lot saying this is the economic opportunity of the 21st century. And he's absolutely right. And if we risk rowing it back anymore or not staying true to the commitment, then we risk missing out on that economic opportunity. And that's why it comes to the credible governing strategy. This is currently seen as the central pledge to Labour's offer to the electorate. So if we don't deliver in that first term, if there is a first term in the next couple of years, then we won't get a second term. We won't get to govern for that next decade. We won't get to see it through to the end. So this is really important to get right and to get the details on. So I'm going to start with a few overarching points on the Green Prosperity Pledge, then I'll go into a bit of detail on the how, and then some of the potential threats that I see. So firstly, on the number itself, I think this might be the only time that I will slightly disagree with one of my fellow panelists, which is, of course, the Committee on Climate Change has said we need 50 to 60 billion pounds per annum from 2030. However, the 28 billion as the public part of that is probably actually the right amount. So at GFI, we work quite closely with the CCC, and that 50 to 60 is public and private investment. And we predict there to be much more than a one-to-one leverage ratio from that public money. So from the outset, Labour needs to be really open in its communications with everyone that there is a target, they're going to cover some of it, but we're going to need to regulate the private sector effectively and help them invest in the correct areas. Just an example, a report I was involved in last year on housing estimated that the 60 billion that Labour's pledged from the Prosperity Pledge for home insulation would leverage in a total of about 220 billion pounds. There's a 1 to 3 ratio there of 60 billion of public, about 160 of private. So with that 28, we should be meeting the CCC numbers as long as we are tracking and ensuring that we are. And there's a few ways that Labour can make sure it does that. But a key focus is on communicating it better. So this is for three main reasons: to anticipate political criticism that will come about during the election, to appeal to voters, as my fellow panellists have touched on, but also to discuss the practicalities as to how this is actually going to work if Labour gets in. So politically, the Tories will target this pledge. It's the single biggest spending pledge that Labour's made. We know they love to say Labour's irresponsible in the economy, even though Reeves is trying her hardest to say we're pricing everything, the fiscal rules and everything else. They will attack this pledge. They will also continue to quote a certain Liam Byrne note from 2010, which we will see on leaflets, probably next to the £28 billion pledge. So Labour needs to be really open and use data to show why this is the fiscally responsible thing to do. And there's lots of evidence out there. The OBR has said that failure to invest in the climate transition will cause debt to GDP to hit around 300%, which is more than 3 times what it is at the minute, much more than it will be if we're borrowing to invest as this pledge is looking at. And in terms of the economic benefits, the actual growth that will come about from this, the UN has said that for every dollar spent on the green transition, dollars because UN, it would reap about $4 in economic benefits. And then similarly with adaptation, for every $1 invested in adaptation, there'll be $6 saved in future lost asset ownership, so stranded assets that will be at risk into the future. And as James says, Labour thus far is not speaking enough about adaptation. And in fact, from the total amount of climate finance spent last year, less than 10% of that was into adaptation. This is a huge issue that Labour really needs to grasp. On communicating to voters, again, I don't want to repeat too much, but this is about how it's going to impact people's lives. The old test of what we're going to put on a leaflet. What am I, as a councillor, trying to help our fantastic candidate in 2 cities win? What am I going to put on a leaflet about the 28 billion? I'm going to want to say, we're going to bring down your bills. You're going to have a warmer home. That's what we need to be able to get onto this. And Labour hasn't yet made that connection strongly enough. It's also about good green skills, talking about the jobs of the future. The Committee on Climate Change recently has said there could be up to 725,000 jobs that are directly contributing to the green agenda. That's really important, really powerful stuff, especially in some of these left behind areas. Up north, around where the coal mine was being looked at. There's a really good opportunity there for a lot of offshore wind, a lot of green hydrogen. Labour hasn't made that counter proposal yet. So that area still pushed to the coal mine because they want jobs. It's a really simple human nature thing to ask for. And also on the NHS, this always obviously comes up as one of the key concerns. If we have a healthier environment, if we have better insulation in our homes, we'll have healthier people. We'll have lower waiting costs, and it will cost the NHS less. So these are all the things that Labour needs to be stressing a little bit more, I think. It's also worth noting that research by LSEF, the Labour Climate Environment Forum, showed that the electorate opinion of Labour increased massively when Starmer and Reeves were seen to be talking about green issues. Labour's voting intention went up by 6 to 8 percentage points when they showed Starmer and Reeves talking about climate and when they showed them videos of them talking about a general vision. Starmer's likability as a leader went up 12 percentage points, and Labour's trust on being the best party of the economy, I can't remember the number, also went up. So this is a really positive thing that Labour needs to seize and needs to acknowledge. And of course, the recent rowback, as many of us know, is due to some disagreements actually in the shadow cabinet itself. There's other shadow cabinet ministers would be good to actually look at some of this evidence and realise that it's in their best interest to continue to talk about this. Finally, about the communication and the practicalities. So this recent rhetoric on dialing back has actually really infuriated me because, as James said, a £28 billion pledge on day one with the current capacity in our civil service would not mean £28 billion out the door in the first year. It takes a while to get these things passed through Parliament, to identify where the funding is going to go, to actually put the investments out there. But Labour has never communicated that because, to be honest, it's not something you could put on a leaflet. But they could have said it somewhere in a bit more detail. The fact that £28 billion per year does not mean from day one it's all going to go out the door. So that lack of clarity has led to a lot of the pushback recently, when actually what's going to happen in practice is pretty much the same, except maybe towards the end we won't have the same total investment because there'll be slightly less in the first couple of years. The other side of this is the role the private sector has to play, so that co-investment to reach that above £50 billion. Labour needs to be honest about what it needs to do to meet this, and this is around regulation. There's a lot of private finance that we talk to pretty much daily at the Institute that wants to invest in the green transition, but for a couple of reasons it doesn't. Either it's afraid of being accused of greenwashing because it's not quite clear what is green, what are the things that are going to help us get to the future, or they actually are greenwashing, and that's a whole other issue in of itself. But this is where something like the green taxonomy is really important. So this is a dictionary, government-backed, science-based, of what is a sustainable activity in every single sector of the economy. It will underpin disclosure requirements for private sector firms. It will start to underpin green bonds, and it will get away from this issue we have at the minute where one firm can advertise itself as green, one as sustainable, one as ESG, and what does that mean? It doesn't actually mean anything. But if we know that there is a government-backed, science-based set of definitions, it helps give a lot more confidence in what these investments are. And this will also support Labour's Green Prosperity Pledge, which also runs the risk of being accused of greenwashing if it can't clearly communicate where it's putting its money into. So this regulatory part of it can't be lost and is very complementary to the overall pledge. A quick few thoughts on the how then. So Labour needs to set out a bit more on the primary sectors and confirm how the various institutions that are being set up, how they're going to interact, because there's various things that are being established here, but also that need to actually track that we are hitting that 50 billion, which sectors are getting the right amount, which aren't, and being able to course correct as and when we aren't meeting it. But also linked to that is the role of local authorities. Again, Labour's been very clear to say that local authorities need more support, we need more devolution, we need to get away from competitive funding, but how that links to climate has not yet been drawn. And as a councillor, again, slightly biased, but councils have influenced over 82% of the country's emissions. This is numbers from the government's net zero strategy last year. Although we only directly control around 2 to 5%, through our procurement, through our placemaking, we can help influence so much more than that. But we need the resources. And a lot of this capital investment should be channeled via local councils who know the area best. They know which communities need this the most. They know what's going to convince certain communities, certain voters, to come on board with this. So Labour needs to be a bit more honest about how it's going to put this money via local authorities. And I think I have heard some really good narratives on this behind closed doors. Hopefully that starts to be a lot more open into the future. I think I had one more quick thing I want to cover, which was just on some of the threats. So on the threats, the first one is, of course, the public not getting behind it, feeling like it's being done to them, not with them. How we can address that is by being honest about how it's going to actually help people and why it's in their best interest to do this. And if we're really clear about that in the election, they'll vote for Labour on that mandate, and then it's a lot more of a doing it with us rather than to. So that's the first bit. The second bit, as I've touched on, is Labour being accused of greenwashing in of itself, or being inefficient or crowding out the private sector. This is where transparency is so important. So the green taxonomy is one part. There is work going on to develop a way to track financial flows, track the public investment, track the private investment. That's going to be really key. And putting that out for the general public to scrutinise is going to be really important. So all of us can say to the government, you're not doing enough in this area, or to hold the private sector to account and to shame them into looking at where they should be mobilising more investment. And the third, as Holly touched on at the end, is to date, a little less so recently, we've had quite good cross-party support on net zero. There is a big risk of this becoming a bit of a culture war topic, of climate becoming a political football like we're seeing with ESG in certain states in America at the minute. And we can't control what other parties do. But what Labour can do is stay really true to its overarching ambition here, to say that climate underpins everything. The rhetoric around the rowing back recently has slightly worried me, because Labour's been really good at this until the last couple of weeks. So again, everyone in the shadow cabinet needs to be able to understand that it's in their best interest to be elected on this mandate, and that actually a lot of this investment will support every single department that comes into government. So I guess I'll just wrap up by saying that climate needs to underpin Labour's offer to the electorate. It currently does, as the largest single pledge. And it is actually quite transformational in relative terms. It's actually better than Biden's IRA, which, again, we can come to some of the questions. But if Labour fails to own it, to communicate it properly, and to actually start to flesh out some of the details, not for what we're going to put on a leaflet, but for what people in a room like this want to see, if it doesn't do all that, then we all lose out. Labour loses out because we'll get bad faith actors that start to criticise it, and they might not win the election. The average person will lose out because of all the benefits that this investment will bring. The UK misses out on a huge economic opportunity that the Tories, with their current policy platform, will simply not take advantage of. And then finally, and we can't risk getting away from this, we all lose out, because we're not going to do as the UK what we need to do to stop the world burning. And there's no economy, there's no financial system, there's no political debate in Central Hall, there's no election in a burning world. So we need to be really clear about this, and Labour really needs to go a lot more strongly on it. As I said, they're doing well, but there's a little risk right now, and we need to stay true to the course.
Right, I think we have some microphones travelling around, so let's take the first set of questions. Could we come over here just to the second row, please? If you could keep your hand up just so they know where to go, that'd be great. Just down here at the front.
Yeah, just a question for the panel on the rowback, or whatever we want to call it, about the 28 billion in the last couple of weeks. And also more really the kind of briefing we've been seeing against Ed Miliband around the same thing. I suppose the panel, do you think this is concerted? Where do you think it comes from? And what do you think the response should be?
Great. Let's take another couple and we'll put them... if we could go to this side, just in the middle there. Fab, thank you. Yep.
I really like the ideas, the practical ideas about how you can make big policies translate on the doorstep to voters. And in that vein, I wondered if you could imagine that you are door knocking for Labour at the next election, not in Westminster because that's cheating, maybe Selby, and you've got a voter for whom climate is not like in their top priorities, they're not anti, but they've heard something that Labour's going to borrow loads of money, and they're really worried it's going to cost them in the end, and it's not for something that they're struggling with at the moment. So they're struggling to afford to put petrol in their car. They're not quite on the breadline, but they've definitely had to knock the idea of a holiday next year on the head. What would you say Labour should be saying to that voter?
Let's just answer those two, actually, because I think they go quite well together, because we've got the kind of high politics and being nasty about Ed Miliband and the doorstep question. So who wants to go first?
Happy to take that. So I'll do the first one. I touched on this already, that I think the so-called rollback has been overstated in a lot of the rhetoric, and that's because in practical terms it would be essentially the same. Like I said, maybe the cumulative total investment by the end will not be the same, but in this first government, first term, if there is a second term, it will essentially be what the original plan was. In terms of where it's coming from, so I've seen some in the last couple of days people saying that it's people in the city pushing back on it. Obviously, I talked to a lot of investors, and a lot of them actually are really happy about this amount of investment. And what a surprise! They're happy that some of their investment is going to be subsidised, or there's going to be a co-investment with government leading it. So it isn't coming from there, and there's actually quite a lot of excitement there that's going to open up new opportunities. And there's the different institutions. The National Wealth Fund should be stepping in where the private sector can't and investing in some of these riskier new tech around green hydrogen production. And that is an opportunity for the private sector to then pick that up in the future. So I don't think it's coming from there. If I'm reading between the lines, I think it is coming from other ministers in the shadow cabinet who are worried about the fact that there's been this big pledge made, and now the shadow chancellor isn't approving other spending plans. And this again comes to the communication point of it. I don't think Labour's communicated well enough internally, so to its own membership, to its own parliamentary party, that this is cross-cutting, that it will support every single area. And I think one of the first things that Labour should be doing is looking at each portfolio and showing how this is going to support it. For the NHS, for Wes Streeting's portfolio, for example, it could be adaptation in hospitals, it could be insulation in hospitals, it might not be, but if it isn't, it still is decreased waiting times to the NHS, decreased costs to the NHS. There's an old stat from what was then Bayes, which said that for every £1 spent on retrofitting social housing, you save 42 pence in the NHS because of people avoiding having to go in winter to A&E due to being too cold in the house or to getting ill. So this is the sort of thing that Labour needs to be putting internally. So in terms of response, I think hold true, don't roll it back anymore, don't risk it being misinterpreted as a bigger rollback, and just be a bit more open with the with the internal party. I'll just take the second question as well quickly. So firstly, obviously it depends on the individual, depends how angry they are when they knock on the door, which varies massively, especially around here. But firstly, I would ask them about what their key issue is. So if their key issue, they were to say, is their energy bills, then you start to talk about how this investment is going to help with that. And that's always the way to do it. You always put it back on the voter. You ask them to offer up what their concern is. And if we have this internal briefing as to how it supports every portfolio, you've got a ready-made list of answers to be able to answer that. And then on the rising cost of borrowing and everything else, if they are one who wants to engage in the details, you can touch on the cost of inaction. You can touch on the fact that the independent OBR has said that if we don't act, it's going to be much more catastrophic, going to be a lot worse for them, appeal to the fact that future generations will have to pick up that bill, or, again, if they're very, if they don't mind the doomism part of it, you can also get to the whole, well, what are we going to do if we don't do it? You know, if the world does end up, you know, burning. Then, so there's various bits to it, but I always start with putting it back on the voter and asking them, well, what's important to you, and then finding that way to link the two things together. So they leave that conversation, they're not going to suddenly think it's the best policy in the world, but they're going to understand it a bit better. They're going to understand why we need to borrow this amount to pay for what we're going to pay for.
Yeah, I would really echo that and just add on the point about kind of, you know, where the 28 billion should go. You know, making, you know, choosing kind of upfront investment and capital investment for stuff that within like a year or so is like really visibly having an impact. So like a good example is like zero emissions buses that in a local community, if you kind of spend on that, you know, and channel that, you know, like Ryan said, through local authorities within a year, that's something that is going to tangibly be visible, is going to impact people's lives. So thinking about innovative ways to kind of use upfront spending that can kind of, yeah, make a really clear case for rather than kind of longer term spending that won't be as visible to voters in the immediate sense. On the first question, I think, yeah, I really agree with what's been said. I think I think it's important to remember like the broader context of a lot of this is obviously being, a lot of the kind of criticism, particularly in the centre-right press around the 28 billion and the fact that this came a week after, you know, 10 days of sustained kind of media attacks on Labour's oil and gas policy specifically. I think that is not insignificant and is worth remembering. And I really agree that, you know, Labour needs to stand firm on this. There was some really great polling out today from ECIU, the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, showing that, you know, 54% of the voters think that tax breaks should go to renewables instead of oil and gas. They also showed that, you know, the kind of stopping oil and gas, that would be the kind of reduction in production would be the same equivalent for one wind farm, so pretty insignificant really. So I think it's just worth remembering that broader context as well. And I think they're obviously grappling with this need to, this kind of ambiguity. They're being quite ambiguous about certain aspects of the policy because of the attacks they're getting. But as we said, they need to be much clearer because that's what's going to cut through with voters. I mean, there were two pieces from Keir Starmer in the Times over the last 2 days. One, the headline was saying oil and gas will be a key part of our energy policy. But then there was another piece the next day kind of that was much more positive and really saying that, you know, highlighting why the UK needs to be a clean energy superpower. So it does feel like they're kind of grappling with those two things. But yeah, I'll kind of leave it at that.
Okay, I might carefully sidestep the internal Labour question, where this is coming from, and go straight to the one about you know, the proverbial doorstep and what you do. I mean, look, there's a general issue. It's been a long period of time, and it's part of the reason it's become a kind of institutional failure that we end up with a media, for example. And if people dug out the BBC's independent review of its own coverage of economics, which was published a few months ago, I mean, it's quite damning. Not so much about economics journalists at the BBC who do a decent job, as the political reporting. That the political reporting of government spending, government borrowing, government finances is invariably sort of bent around, certainly for the last few years, last 13 years now actually, bent around a series of kind of economically illiterate lines often emanating from Conservative headquarters about the cupboard is bare, there is no money left, the credit card is maxed out, none of which makes a great deal of sense in any economics terms, but we end up with a discussion that works like this. And it feeds into a political problem that if you want to be serious about what government could do, it needs a little bit more of a, let's be blunt, grown-up conversation about how you're going to pay for things and what you're going to do when you get the money to pay for things. And I think that is changing. right? I think the last few years have seen a real shift around this, but it's still there, and it's still there in people's heads. In terms of dealing with it on the doorstep, I usually think that an argument along the lines of, you can either say, if a business wants to grow, it needs to raise the money to do that. You have to borrow to get the money to grow your business at some point. This is what all businesses do. Or if you know somebody's wanting to buy a house, you don't say to them, God, don't get a mortgage, it's a huge debt. You say, actually, you're going to get a house as well, so people get mortgages because you also get a house. If the government's going off borrowing money and spending it on wind farms, you get a valuable asset out the other side. Now, there is I think it's a little bit too technical it's not something you want to land in an election campaign. Without getting too much into it, I think one of the things, there's a list that went wrong in 2019, was that they tried to do this. But you could change how we think about government accounts so that instead of as now, where all we look at is the debt, you say, okay, as well as debt, what are the assets that government owns? At which point, you investing in some share or some part of a wind farm through GB Energy, for example, that would be an asset. And you take that away from your debt. And lo and behold, your whole balance sheet actually looks quite good. Instead, we're just fixating on the debt. Now, that's a big thing that Labour could do, and it would have to start preparing the ground now. I think it needs to also start preparing the ground on being a bit more upfront about what its fiscal rules actually are, about who is actually going to pay more money in terms of taxes, because I don't see any way, if you want a programme that's going to do something to avoid this question, there isn't the proverbial magic money tree out there, and it's no use, if you're Wes Streeting saying it's okay, artificial intelligence is going to make running the NHS really cheap, right? You actually are going to have to do things like probably spend £10 billion on the repair backlog that has now built up, and there isn't a robot that will do that for you for free. That involves paying people to do this. So there is going to have to be a serious conversation about that. The grave danger, I think, that we're running into now is that that conversation happens just before the election, at which point it's a Labour tax bombshell, look at all this debt, absolute car crash, rather than you've prepared the ground sometime around about now. So maybe it's a good thing that we're having this discussion about £28 billion of borrowing now, rather than in 18 months or 6 months' time or whenever the election is, right? It's better to get this out of the way now. But let's be a bit more serious about what this will involve and what the financing of it looks like. I think that's the big picture problem there.
Let's get some more. Yeah. Hands up. If we could take one just this side towards the back, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you. Just a quick question. Given that it takes quite a few years for a new railway to be built or that sort of thing, what should the next Labour government's policy be towards motorists with a view towards the environment?
Okay. And then if you could pop your hand up again just so... Oh, there we go. There's the microphone there.
Hello. Thank you for a very interesting panel today. I note the importance of coordination with the private sector and with local authorities in order to ensure a successful green transition, just to summarise. However, climate challenges are very much a global issue, as we all know. What political and governmental tools and powers should a Labour government use to ensure effective global cooperation on the climate issues and ensure an effective green transition here in the UK, unless it's a case of fixing our own roof first before cooperating with others?
Okay, and let's get one more, I think. Could we just come to the front here? And we're going to have super quick answers so people can get their sandwiches.
Hi, my name's Richard. I work in cyber defence, but specifically with about 15 new energy companies right now. So it's a very interesting conversation for me. And I'm here in an individual capacity as well, before I go on to say that these companies make no money. They're either losing money or they've got absolutely tiny margins, and that despite the unbelievable efficiency gains that nobody even dreamt of in, like, for example, wind farms, etc. They still don't make money. They're never going to be part of anybody's pension. So the advantage is the obvious one for the environment, but also jobs. So I'm wondering what Labour might do to ensure that when we invest this money, it really goes into British jobs.
Holly, can we start with you and then we'll go James?
I'm really sorry. I'm going to start with the second question. Maybe you can remind us of the first question. Yeah, I think the point about global cooperation on climate is really, really important. And I mean, obviously, Rachel Reeves has been visiting the US, and kind of the whole piece about Labour's economic policy and kind of Bidenomics and her speech that she gave there, I think is the start of them starting to kind of think. I mean, that's obviously linked to the kind of Inflation Reduction Act as well, and the kind of UK response to that. I think I'd be really keen to see them, Labour do more on like the global methane pledge ahead of like COP28 and stuff, and thinking about the leadership they can show there. I think it's obviously needs a lot of there's not a lot of thinking around that. I think they need to be clear how they're going to work, and particularly on things like trade as well, how they're going to, and trade deals, obviously, after Brexit, the government's kind of agreed lots of new trade deals. I'd be really keen to see Labour build out its trade policy and show how it's building in environment and also, climate justice into its kind of international kind of collaboration on that. Could you remind me of this last question, please? I was making notes while. About
energy companies not making cash.
Energy companies. Yes, I'll take the one around energy companies. And this kind of, I guess, touches on the point about one of the kind of questions was around the role of Great British Energy, the kind of Labour's proposed energy company. Sorry, I'm just getting my notes. So I think they can really use that as an example of how to kind of get those issues around domestic supply chains and workers' rights. I think if they really use Great British Energy as an example of that, that can then kind of, that can be an example for others to sort of emulate. I think as well, thinking about, obviously on the kind of oil and gas point about the kind of just transition and what, that's often a term that's used quite vaguely, but what does that actually look like in practice? And particularly I think on skills, that's something that needs a lot more investment, skills and retraining, and how they'll actually make sure that, people working in the oil and gas industry at the moment and the workers that will be needed in new green industries actually have that support and those schemes that they're able to kind of make that transition.
Okay. Yeah, all right, so I'll go in sort of reverse order, but I might also, for time, leave the motorists for a question for somebody else. Look, the question here, I think, is basically, how do you do this? Touched on, which is you want to spend all this money decarbonising the economy. You could do that by just paying loads and loads of money to somewhere else to install all the equipment you need. The better way to do it is exactly as you say, is try and at least start to manufacture some of the stuff here. That means industrial strategy, which is ominous if you're Britain, because for 40 years this is something that you're not supposed to do, and it's historically sort of held up as something that can't possibly happen. Although there is a good recent example, which you can finesse and learn from, of precisely doing an industrial strategy to support manufacturing in Britain, which is what the last Labour government did after the 2008 crisis for car manufacturing, which was absolutely wiped out by the crash at the time, but it was direct government support with tax breaks on one side, with direct support and coordination on the other, that delivered a real expansion of car manufacturing, for good or ill, I suppose, by this point, in Britain, right? So it can be done, and that's what you need to do. It's a lot, and it's going to be difficult for our civil service to do it, to be blunt, because it's a long period of time of not doing this, but that's what needs to happen. On the international coordination, I think it's a really good question. There is the obvious one, maybe not the obvious one, but the one that's being done, right, is because America's doing this, we can tie ourselves into the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's a clear sort of win there. The other bit, and the bit that I think we aren't talking about enough, is there's a massive rest of the world, in fact, the entire global south, for example, that we could have something useful to say to, that we're well positioned in Britain. And actually, it's to Mark Carney's credit that the Bank of England took a lead on this in thinking about how central banks and how financial systems can start to include climate damage, the cost mitigation, all the other things there, and start to build that into how we think about financing in the future. Britain could actually set a bit of a lead in this. We did have a department that was well respected globally for doing this sort of thing, which was DFID. We could tie that into what we're doing with decarbonisation. The specific question that's coming through a lot right now is not just mitigation or adaptation. It's, it's from COP last year, is the question of loss and damages. How do you pay for all the chaos that's ensuing out of this? Can we set a lead? Can Labour set a lead on innovative ways to finance loss and damage in the global south and across the world?
Yeah. Ryan, what's Labour's offer to the motorist?
Oh, I want to talk on global as well.
Oh,
is that okay?
I've tried.
I won't do number three.
I've tried for you. Okay.
I will do motorist as well. Quickly on global then. So It's actually a really important question. The UK has an outsized influence here because of, as James was just touching on, the City of London. It's the largest financial sector in the world. By all indices, it's currently the leading green financial sector because of its regulation. So taxonomy, transition plans that are being developed, TCFD being mandatory. The UK has a really good position here to support developing economies, to support them with the knowledge as to how you develop these things, the frameworks, which will then help them in their transitions in turn. Also, things like the taxonomy will be able to underpin ODA and other sorts of foreign investments that the UK does. So the UK actually has a really important role to play internationally, and that involves also going to the various international fora that exist, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, the G7 and G20 have working groups on sustainable finance, where the UK is really valued in its opinion. I mean, just yesterday I was speaking to a delegation from Hong Kong. They're trying to figure out how they're going to do this. They're one of the biggest financial centres in the world, and they want to learn from the UK. This government doesn't have a coordinated approach to do this. Labour should. And I think post-Brexit, there's this whole question as to what is the UK's position in the world now. And I think this is where we have a role to play. It's with our financial centre and with UK law, and we can help to push that further abroad. Motorists. So we obviously need to reduce the number of people who are driving on the streets, and we need to say that in a way that is, again, appealing to local people. We can't say 15-minute cities anymore, apparently, but we can talk about people being able to walk to their local shop, cycle to their local GP. And, you know, London's a really actually quite good example of this. In Westminster, less than 30% of households own cars, and of those who own them, they're parked in more than 94% or 95% of the time. Because we've got great public transport with tubes that arrive every 3 minutes, and, you know, we get a lot of complaints if a tube is 7 or 8 minutes. And up in Manchester, I'm from Stockport, you got to wait 20 to 30 minutes for the first train into Manchester. It's a completely different world. And, you know, even recently, the issues with Avanti West Coast coming down to London, it's now often quicker to drive from Stockport to London than it is to get the train. And it's obviously much cheaper to drive. Those incentives are completely the wrong way round. So when we're talking about what we're going to do to motorists, it's also nationalising the train operating companies, ensuring that they run more frequently. I think I caught the end of the last panel, and they were saying how it's really easy to get to London, but you can't travel from the northwest to the northeast. It takes me just as long to get from Stockport to Leeds as it does from Stockport to London. That sort of thing is ridiculous. So offer to the motorists is investing in public transport, helping them in their local area walk and cycle to places, ensuring there's investment in the things that you really need on your high streets. And then there was a third point, obviously EVs. So in the areas that are still going to need cars, massive investment in EV infrastructure. Here in Westminster, we have 2,300 EV charging points, more than the whole of the Northwest. I love that for Westminster. I love it for everyone who has to, all the black cabs, but I hate it for the rural areas in the north who need this a lot more than we do. So that needs to be a big focus. It comes back to the way that the Green Prosperity Pledge needs to go via local authorities on a non-competitive, means-tested basis to identify who needs this investment the most, because we don't need any more support for EV charging here. They do need it out in Stockport.
Great. Well, can we all thank our panellists and have a drink?